My name is Elias Thorne, and I write this not for absolution, but for clarity. My son, a man I barely recognize now, suggested I put it all down, before the nightmares finally claim my sanity. He believes the truth can be excised like a tumor. I know better. The truth isn't something you cut out. It's something that reflects back at you from the darkest corners of your soul, a mirror showing you what you allowed to become. It began, as all great mistakes do, with a desperate need for money. I was a philosophy student at Ravenscroft Academy, an institution cloaked in gargoyles and generational wealth, where I, an impoverished scholarship student, felt acutely out of place. My tuition loan was due, and the shame of withdrawing was a colder dread than the New England winter. That's when I saw the advertisement tacked to a bulletin board, half hidden by notices for tutoring sessions and band practices. Psychological study, an examination of authority and degradation. Volunteers needed for a 2-week simulation. Generous stipend, $1,500. Apply at the Department of Behavioral Sciences. The year was not 1971, the money was very real, and the potential payoff for 2 weeks of essentially doing nothing was life-changing. A few clinical psychologists wanted to observe the dynamics of power, guards and prisoners. It sounded clinical, academic, and safely detached. I signed up immediately. The initial screening was tedious. Psychological profiles, Rorschach tests, and long, probing interviews with Professor Amory Blackwood. Blackwood was the architect of the project, a lanky, precise man whose eyes held a distant, unsettling calm, like deep water under ice. He assured us the environment would be safe, strictly controlled, and ethical. He was looking for subjects who were psychologically sound and possessed no latent psychotic tendencies. Irony, it seems, is the universe's favorite torture. I passed. I was assigned to the prisoner group. My uniform would be number 307. I spent the next few days preparing my mind, telling myself it was just theater, a role-playing game with high stakes. The experiment commenced not with a polite summons, but with a shock. It was a cold, late afternoon. 2 uniformed officers, real, or frighteningly good actors, slammed into my shared apartment, their movements sharp and brutal. They accused me of armed robbery, threw me against the patrol car, and frisked me with unnecessary violence. Fear, genuine and paralyzing, washed away the last shreds of my intellectual detachment. This wasn't a game. This felt terrifyingly real. At the local station, the booking process was a terrifying ritual of degradation. They fingerprinted me, took a miserable mugshot, and then, without explanation, blindfolded me with a rough, oil-stained cloth. It was during the transit to the actual facility that the simulation cracked, giving way to something far older and fouler. I was crammed into the back of a van, shoulder to shoulder with other shivering recruits. The air thickened with a metallic, primal smell. I felt a presence in the vehicle that wasn't human. It was heavy, wet, and smelled faintly of brine and decay. I could hear its breathing, a slow, irregular rasping, like wet sandpaper rubbing against bone. It wasn't the breath of a man, not even a man struggling. It was the sound of a thing simply existing. "Move it, maggot," a voice rasped from the front. It was flat, emotionless, but laced with a strange, liquid hiss. I felt something cold and hard press against the back of my neck. Then, a sickening sensation, wet, heavy breath washing over my skin. The fear became a physical object in my throat, choking me. I bit back a scream. This wasn't the police. This was something else entirely. The journey ended abruptly. I was dragged out and led, stumbling, down a flight of cold stone steps. The temperature plummeted. The air here was heavy with the scent of mold, stale water, and something acrid, almost like burnt sulfur. When the blindfold was finally ripped away, my eyes adjusted slowly to the harsh, fluorescent glare. I stood in a corridor carved from rough-hewn granite, not a modern university basement, but an ancient dungeon. This was the Labyrinthos. 2 guards, wearing stiff, dark uniforms and inexplicably dark sunglasses, flanked me. The entity from the van was gone. The processing was swift and dehumanizing. They stripped me, searched every cavity, and then sprayed me head to toe with a stinging disinfectant. I was handed a thin, grey sackcloth tunic, my uniform, and a pair of rubber sandals. My only identity was the number stenciled crudely on the back, 307. I was marched down a long, echoing hall where the cells lay. They were iron cages set into the stone, each containing 3 crude cots and a bucket, the makeshift toilet. I was ushered into the second cell, where 2 other prisoners were already waiting. One was Marcus, 416, a soft-spoken arts major I recognized from the screening. "Just keep your head down," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "They call him the Warden." I glanced out into the corridor. Standing at the far end, overseeing the filing in of the last prisoners, was a man who immediately chilled me to the bone. He was taller than the other guards, with an unnaturally stiff posture. His uniform was darker, and the reflection on his perfectly opaque, black sunglasses made it impossible to read his face. His lips, visible below the glasses, were curled in a permanent, subtle smirk of utter, contemptuous authority. This was Cow Y. Silas Vane, the Warden. He hadn't moved, but I felt his attention zero in on me. He tilted his head slightly, and the sheer, focused malice in that gesture made my blood run cold. I chose the cot furthest from the bars, trying to put distance between myself and the oppressive darkness gathering outside. The heavy iron door clanged shut. The experiment had begun. Or perhaps, the nightmare had finally found its footing. The shadows in the corner of the cell seemed deeper than they should be, and the cold of the stones seeped not just into my bones, but into my courage. I lay down, listening to the low, frantic breathing of my cellmates, and waited for the night. I didn't know then that the night would bring the truth about the Warden, and the true purpose of the Labyrinthos. The iron door was thick, but it was useless against the cold, hollow sound of the facility. Every shuffle, every distant clanging, amplified itself in the granite corridor and filtered into our cell, 307. I tried to sleep, forcing my mind to recall the logic puzzles I loved, anything to anchor myself to reality. But the constant, suffocating anxiety was a physical weight on my chest. Marcus, 416, and the third prisoner, a quiet physics student named Finn, 882, were already curled up on their thin mattresses. There were no lights in the cells, only the residual, sickly yellow glare from the corridor's ceiling lights that cast long, grotesque shadows. Hours passed, marked only by the random, performative counts executed by the student guards. They would slam their batons against the bars, screaming our numbers, 307, 416, 882, "On your feet, maggots," and force us to stand at attention until they tired of the sport. Each encounter eroded the facade of safe experiment. These guards, likely my peers, had found an ugly pleasure in their roles far too quickly. Sometime deep in the dead hours, after the last count, I was jolted awake not by a noise, but by a sudden, profound drop in temperature. It was as if the air itself had been flash-frozen. I lay perfectly still, my eyes slits in the darkness. The cell door was ajar, not violently forced, but slightly, deliberately ajar. The heavy, metallic smell I'd noticed in the van was back, overwhelming the damp stone. And with it, the sound, that slow, dreadful rasping breath, closer now, right at the foot of my cot. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain it would alert the entity. I risked a subtle turn of my head. Standing over the cot nearest the door, the one belonging to Marcus, 416, was Cow Y. Silas Vane. He looked exactly as he had before, stiff, unnaturally tall, clad in the archaic uniform, the black sunglasses concealing his eyes. Marcus was clearly awake. His body was rigid under the thin blanket, his mouth open in a silent, paralyzed scream. The Warden stood motionless for what felt like eternity, bathing Marcus in the sinister cold radiating from his form. Then, the horror began. Silas Vane slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. The effect was instantaneous, devastating. The light, that sickly fluorescent glare, did not reflect off his eyes. It was absorbed. Where his eyes should have been were two perfect, circular, obsidian mirrors. They didn't just reflect the room, they seemed to reflect a cold, depthless void that lay behind the room. And in the center of those mirrors, I saw two pinpricks of pure, malevolent red light flickering. Vane lowered his head to Marcus. His lips stretched into a wet, inhuman grin, a movement that should have been impossible for human musculature. Then, the jaw itself began to deform. It split. Not hinged, but fractured right down the center, peeling back the flesh and bone to reveal a cavernous, pulsating cavity. The sound was a squelching, wet tearing. The resulting structure was not a mouth for speech, but a grotesque, bony more resembling a shattered orchid. From the depths of his throat, something thick and black began to unspool. It wasn't a tongue in the biological sense. It was a muscle, fat and segmented like a deep-sea leech, ending in 3 wickedly sharp, chitinous prongs. It smelled overwhelmingly of salt and old, stagnant blood. I watched, choked by the terror that had become my master, as this appendage, this tongue of the void, slowly coiled and extended. It bypassed Marcus's mouth and throat, moving with agonizing deliberation towards his head. The tip hovered over Marcus's temple for a moment. Then, with a horrifying, sticky sound, it found its mark, Marcus's ear canal. I heard a muted, wet thud as Vane pressed the tongue's head against the soft flesh of Marcus's outer ear. I couldn't see the penetration, but the sight of Marcus's reaction was enough to atomize my sanity. Marcus's eyes, wide with sheer, ultimate terror, rolled up to show only the whites. A single, thick stream of blood, black in the dim light, began to trickle from his nostril. His entire body arched off the cot in a spasm so violent I thought his spine would snap, yet he remained utterly silent. No gasp, no yell, only the raw, visceral agony etched onto his features. Vane remained bent over him for several minutes. The only sounds were the rasping of the warden's breath and the terrible, wet sucking noise emanating from the contact point. Then, Vane slowly retracted the organ. It recoiled back into his mouth, which sealed itself back together with a sickening sound of damp tissue reforming. He put his sunglasses back on, the transition back to human an act of casual blasphemy. He straightened, glanced briefly at Marcus, who was now slack and utterly still, staring blankly at the ceiling, and then his eyes, obscured by the mirror lenses, swung directly to my cot. My heart stopped. I was certain he knew I had witnessed the entire, unspeakable act. He gave a slight, satisfied nod, the tiniest tilt of his head, and then, without another sound, he exited the cell, locking the iron gate with a decisive, terrifying clang. Finn, the other prisoner, was whimpering softly. He had seen nothing, but the residual atmosphere of cold dread and the silence of Marcus was enough. I scrambled off my cot, shaking uncontrollably, rushing to Marcus. Marcus. Marcus, are you okay? Marcus lay motionless. His body was limp, his skin clammy. But when I gently turned his head, I saw them. His eyes were open. But they were no longer the warm brown of the art student I met days ago. They were vacant, still, and worst of all, they were perfectly reflective. They were the same cold, obsidian mirrors I had seen moments ago on Silas Vane's face. They held no light, no soul, only the blank, polished surface of a terrible, terrible truth. He was awake, but Marcus was gone. Something else was looking out of his eyes, a passive, empty reflection of the Labyrinthos. We have to fight. We have to get out, I whispered, scrambling back to my own cot. I tore the crudely stenciled 307 tag from my tunic. It was a futile, symbolic act, but it felt necessary. We began pulling the cots, heavy steel frames grating on the stone floor, piling them against the cell door. It was a pathetic barricade against an ancient evil, but it was all we had. I could hear the muffled cries of alarm from the other cells as they, too, heard Marcus's chilling silence and the wet, lingering scent of Vane. We had signed up for a simulation, but we had woken up inside a ritual. Day 2. The morning brought with it a shift change, heralded by the screeching of hinges and the hollow echoing of heavy boots. We had survived the night, our makeshift barricades of cots standing as a flimsy testament to our defiance, a childish gesture against the cosmic horror we now faced. We, Finn, myself, and the 6 other prisoners scattered across the 3 cells, rallied. Marcus, 416, remained unresponsive, his mirrored eyes staring past the iron bars into some private, cold dimension. His silence, more than any sound, fueled our resolve. We taunted the incoming guards, mocking their authority, reveling in the small victory of having forced them to deal with a rebellion on their watch. The student guards, young men who, just 48 hours ago, had worried about term papers, were furious. They screamed at the night shift, whose members slunk away, their faces pale, avoiding our eyes. The night shift knew what we had seen. They had served alongside Silas Vane. I watched the warden follow the retreating night shift towards the exit stairs. Just as he reached the threshold, he stopped and turned. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the opaque sunglasses, just long enough for me to catch that terrifying, dual reflection. He didn't sneer, he didn't threaten. He offered a slight, knowing wink. It was a gesture of profound intimacy and chilling confidence. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise that the game was far from over, and that I was the chosen opponent. Within the hour, the counterattack began. The guards returned with reinforcements and fire extinguishers. They didn't speak. They moved with a robotic, synchronized brutality that spoke volumes about how quickly they had succumbed to the spirit of the Labyrinthos. We braced ourselves against the door. The metal frames of the cots groaned under our weight. Then, the fire extinguisher blast hit. It wasn't the sound that broke us, but the sensation. The carbon dioxide hit our faces and exposed skin with an agonizing, needle-like intensity. It was the purest cold I had ever felt, a physical pain that burrowed deep into the bone. We gasped, stumbled, and were forced to retreat to the back wall of the cell, defeated by the searing, Arctic assault. The guards surged in, leaping over the barricade. They were a frenzy of dark uniforms and flailing batons. I was thrown against the cold granite wall. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. Then, he was there. Silas Vane pinned me, his immense weight crushing me. I could smell the decay on his breath, a fetid mixture of stagnant water and something metallic, like stale pennies. He didn't hit me. He simply tore the fragile sackcloth tunic from my chest, exposing my skin to the chilling air and his rancid proximity. His face was inches from mine. Below the glasses, his lips were drawn back in a taut, anticipatory smile. "This was always going to be tough, little philosopher," Vane rasped, the sound vibrating directly in my inner ear, bypassing my eardrums. "But it will be far tougher if you insist on being stupid." His breath, damp and utterly repulsive, washed over my throat. As the other prisoners succumbed to the savage onslaught in the surrounding cells, a horrifying understanding coalesced in my mind. This entity wasn't a guard. It was the engine of the experiment, the core of the Labyrinthos. It was feeding on the despair and the breakdown of order. The physical violence subsided as swiftly as it began. The guards retreated, leaving us battered, bruised, and gasping for air amidst the overturned cots. The lesson was etched onto our bruised skin. Resistance was futile. But the worst was yet to come. The warden, having established physical dominance, began the psychological corrosion. He spent the rest of the day inventing petty, crippling punishments. Control was absolute. When we drank, when we ate the tasteless slop they provided, and when we were permitted to use the bucket. As ringleaders, I, 307, and Finn, 882, were singled out. We were dragged to a tiny storage closet at the far end of the corridor, solitary confinement. It was a space so cramped, we couldn't sit up straight. The absolute darkness and the knowledge of Vane prowling nearby were maddening. I could hear Finn, normally so quiet, sobbing uncontrollably. He wasn't crying for himself, I realized, but for the loss of the world outside, the loss of any meaning. When we were finally returned to our cell, Finn was broken. His grief turned rapidly into a terrifying, self-destructive rage. He began punching the stone walls, his hands quickly splitting open. The white plaster became splattered with his blood. He screamed incoherently about equations and gravity, trying to cling to the logic that the Labyrinthos was tearing away. But it was his eyes that terrified me. When I looked at Finn, attempting to reason with him, I saw that his pupils were fixed and dilated, and the surface of his irises had taken on a faint, oily sheen. They were beginning to reflect. Not as cleanly as Marcus's obsidian mirrors, but the taint was there, a subtle, cold corruption beginning at the edges. A couple of the less hardened student guards, pale and hesitant, finally decided they had seen enough. They called for Professor Blackwood, the project director, arguing that Finn was having a psychological break and needed medical attention. Vane watched the exchange with that subtle, predatory smirk. When Finn was let out, howling and fighting the guards, Vane accompanied them. "Must ensure the integrity of the data, Professor," I heard Vane's unsettling, raspy voice echo down the hall. "A contaminant must be contained." I can only imagine the dark ritual that took place outside our view. When Finn was eventually returned, hours later, he was profoundly silent. He walked straight to his cot, sat down, and curled up against the stone wall. He didn't look at me. When I called his number, he didn't respond. His eyes, when he blinked slowly, were now unmistakable, perfectly reflective, empty mirrors. But he did speak once, in a flat, toneless voice that wasn't his. He whispered, over and over, staring at the ceiling, "You can't leave. You can't quit. The Labyrinthos needs the sacrifice." Vane walked past our cell, his gaze sweeping over me before settling on the new husk of 882. He laughed. It was a dry, cruel sound, devoid of warmth or joy, merely the sound of satisfied consumption. I felt a cold, impotent fury burn in my gut. This thing was not conducting an experiment. It was performing an exorcism of light. Later that day, 2 prisoners who had shown early signs of compliance and obedience were moved out of their cage and into the 3rd cell, which Vane had designated as the Cell of Light. They were given back their personal clothes and allowed to clean themselves. They were the privileged prisoners, and Vane paraded them past our cages, a visual lesson in the rewards of submission. I hated them almost as much as I hated Vane. As they were led past by the towering warden, their smug expressions turning to confusion under the glare of Vane's presence, a momentary clarity struck me. Vane wasn't rewarding them. He was fattening them up. He had new pets. That night, the true horror of Vane's methods became brutally clear. That night, the true horror of Vane's methods became brutally clear. The change in the student guards was complete. The day shift, though cruel, still acted with a performative malice. The night shift, however, was different. When they shuffled on duty, led by the towering, omnipresent form of Cow Silas Vane, they moved like automatons. They were pale, their eyes unfocused, their movements lacking the spontaneity of human decision. They were simply extensions of the Labyrinthos, conduits for Vane's will. Does the bastard ever sleep? I whispered to the empty, mirrored eyes of Finn, 882. He, of course, offered no reply, only the unsettling reflection of my own frantic face. Vane paused directly in front of cell 307. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the 2 guards flanking him. Wordlessly, the guards unlocked the heavy iron door. There was no theatricality, no screaming. Just a cold, methodical invasion. I stood up, desperate to buy time, to reason with the lingering shadow of humanity in them. Wait. We did what you asked. We are compliant. One of the guards responded by slamming a billy club across my lower face. The force was staggering. I heard a sickening crack and tasted the immediate, metallic rush of blood from my lower lip. I stumbled backwards, hitting the stone wall, the pain momentarily blotting out everything else. Before I could even register the shock, they were upon us. They began beating us in earnest, not as punishment, but as a chore. The guards' faces were utterly expressionless, masks of dull indifference. Blows rained down on my ribs, back, and legs. It was the absolute lack of emotion that was the most terrifying element of the assault. They weren't angry, they were simply cleaning us. And all the while, Silas Vane stood outside the bars, watching. His reflection eyes were fixed on my suffering, and the slight, contemptuous smirk was plastered across his decomposing lips. He was pitiless, sadistic, and completely satisfied. He was an audience of one, savoring the performance of our physical and spiritual breakdown. The beating seemed to last an eternity, punctuated only by the dull, wet thwack of wood connecting with flesh. When they finally tired of their silent brutality, they stepped back, their faces still blank, their movements precise. I lay on the cold stone floor, tasting blood and grit, listening to the groans of the other prisoners. My body was a tapestry of throbbing pain. But the night's work was not over. Vane directed his guards across the corridor to the cell that still housed the other rebel prisoners, those who hadn't been completely broken like Finn and Marcus. Those prisoners shrank back in visceral terror as the guards, without pausing, unlocked their cell and subjected them to the exact same, silent savagery. Vane remained in the corridor, a silent conductor of this symphony of pain. Then, I watched him move. He walked past the cell where the brutalization was ongoing, and stopped before the 3rd, brightly lit cell, the Cell of Light, where the 2 privileged prisoners were housed. I had hated those 2 students for their compliance, for their self-satisfied submission. But as Vane stood before their cage, a wave of profound, sickening pity washed over me. He wasn't punishing them now, he was collecting. Vane unlocked the door and stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a low thud that seemed to absorb all surrounding noise. The only remaining sounds in the corridor were the labored, wet gasps of my cellmates, the muffled sound of the billy clubs hitting meat in the opposite cage, and the pervasive rasping of Vane's breath. Then, from the Cell of Light, the isolated, muffled sounds began. First, a quick, sharp gasp, the sound of profound shock, not injury. Second, a terrible, drawn-out wail, immediately cut short, choked by something thick and wet. Finally, a third and last scream, a high-pitched sound of utter, final despair, abruptly silenced as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth, no, as if the air itself had been violently inhaled. And then, silence. A profound, absolute silence emanating from the Cell of Light, deeper than the darkness outside, more chilling than the cold. I knew. With a clarity that cut through the pain, I knew. He was feeding. He was not consuming their flesh. He was consuming their souls, their essence, turning their compliance into energy, transforming the students into his own reflected husks. The screams were not the sound of physical death, but the sound of the final, agonizing exorcism of light. My consciousness, already weakened by days of starvation and fear, started to dim. There was nothing I could do. I was shackled, broken, and helpless, a witness to the consumption of my peers. The darkness, absolute and merciful, began to claim me. I slipped into a painful, restless void, the lingering taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of that last silent scream echoing in the hollow chambers of the Labyrinthos. I awoke on the morning of day 3 with a throbbing, relentless ache in every part of my body. My head pounded where the billy club had struck, and dried blood was glued to my lower lip. The first sound I heard was the terrible, cold clanging of the iron doors opening. The day shift, fresh and energetic, poured into the corridor. Their first act was a brutal shuffling ritual. The surviving rebels from the cell opposite, haggard, broken figures who looked as if they hadn't slept in a week, were dragged out and moved towards the cell of light. Simultaneously, the 2 privileged prisoners from the cell of light, who Vane had been feeding upon last night, were led out. They were husks. Their skin was pale and waxy, pulled tight across their facial bones. They moved with a disturbing, slow gait. They were entirely, utterly silent. They were steered toward the newly entered cell of the former rebels. "I think you've served your time, boys," Silas Vane announced, his voice a mocking purr as the 2 groups passed each other. "Nothing but the high life for you now. Just a little rest." I grimaced as the 2 husks turned to face me from their new cage. I didn't need to see them clearly. I knew. Their eyes were perfect, cold mirrors, reflecting the damp granite and the sinister light of the hallway. They were his now. The day shift guards, taking their cue from Vane, proceeded with a different kind of torture, forced physical exertion. For the rest of the morning, we were forced to do push-ups until our arms collapsed, jumping jacks until our muscles screamed in agony, and bizarre, humiliating calisthenics invented solely to break our spirits. Whenever I collapsed from the sheer exhaustion, the guards would immediately kick me, not hard, but just enough to be painful, and then, in a monotone chorus devoid of human emotion, they would utter a single, chilling command: "More." Their faces remained utterly blank. They were no longer punishing us. They were training us to be broken. When the enforced exercise finally ended, we were collapsed on the floor, our chests heaving, our limbs useless. Vane prowled the corridor, announcing, "Today is visiting day. Time to polish up for the outside world." The pre-visitation ritual was horrifyingly intimate. One by one, the physical evidence of our torment was removed. Guards forcibly dressed us in long-sleeved tunics to hide the bruises, and then came the wash and shave. When my turn came, my blood ran cold as the shadow of Vane fell over me. The bastard himself stepped forward to prepare me. I struggled, trying to pull away, but the massive bulk of the warden pinned me against the wall, the cold granite biting into my shoulder blades. Vane retrieved a damp, rough sponge and began to wipe the dried blood from my split lip and face, his touch agonizingly slow, almost loving. His one large hand cupped the back of my head, holding me steady. "Now, come on, little philosopher. I'm just trying to make you presentable for your folks," Vane whispered, his voice too close, too wet. "We don't want them to see you dirty now, do we?" He then produced a gleaming, cutthroat razor. I whimpered, a low, animal sound I couldn't contain. Vane brought the cold steel right up against my jugular. "And of course, Elias, if you decide to tell them about me," he paused, the razor resting lightly against my skin, "I'm sure I could find other things we could do with this blade. Things that would make your mother scream louder than those boys in the cell of light. You understand me, little philosopher." I choked down a ragged sob and nodded frantically. "Good boy." He proceeded to shave the stubble from my face, the ritual of forced cleanliness making me feel profoundly defiled. We were led out cell by cell. First, the husks from the cell of light, the latest additions to Vane's collective. Then, once they returned, the newly privileged prisoners who had just been released from the rebel cells were led out. I watched their parents greet them. I was stunned. How could they not see the change? My peers looked like ghosts. Their demeanor was drastically altered, their enthusiasm gone, their silence profound. They seemed capable of suppressing the reflection in their eyes only partially, yet the parents seemed oblivious, attributing the change to stress and sleep deprivation. They simply couldn't conceive of the true horror lurking beneath the surface. Finally, it was the turn of the original rebels, my cell. I nearly collapsed when I saw my parents. The wave of relief and love was so overwhelming it was almost painful. It felt like a lifetime had passed since I'd felt their embrace. But Vane's threat, the phantom kiss of the razor blade against my throat, kept me paralyzed. I did my part, speaking only in carefully managed clichés about the intensity of the role-playing. My mother, however, was not fooled. She knew me too well. Elias, you look dreadful. I've never seen you so pale. Are they treating you well? Tell me the truth. Before I could form a credible lie, Vane, ever the shadow, cut in. He had been loitering nearby, playing the role of the concerned superintendent. What is the matter with your boy? Doesn't he sleep well? He said, his tone dripping with false concern. He then turned to my father. Sir, don't you think your son can handle a simple sociological study? Perhaps he's not as robust as we thought. My father, ever the proud, stoic man, bristled at the challenge to my manhood. Of course he can handle it. He's a Thorne. He's a tough kid. He's a leader of men. He turned to my mother, his voice firming with forced conviction. Come on, honey, we've wasted enough time already. We'll see you next week, son. As my parents were led away, their confidence entirely misplaced, I wanted to scream. Vane had played them, manipulated their pride and their faith in me, turning it into another shackle. I collapsed onto the floor, silent tears streaming down my face. Through my blurring vision, I looked across the corridor into the cell of light. The current inhabitants, the boys Vane had rested after feeding, were staring back at me. Blank-faced, utterly silent, their eyes were nothing but perfect, cold reflections, consuming the sight of my breakdown. I was alone, and Vane had successfully severed my last tether to the outside world. Day 4. I awoke with a jolt, not from a sound, but from a profound, sickening sense of wrongness. My body screamed with bruises, but my mind was sharper than it had been in days, honed by the acute terror of isolation. I opened my eyes and saw my remaining cellmate, the last rebel besides myself, standing silently by the bars. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on something beyond the corridor. I immediately scrambled up, fearing I was late for the morning count, only to see Cow Silas Vane standing by the open door of our cell block. He looked different. Gone was the predatory smirk. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. His veins pulsed like thick, black wires against the pale skin of his neck. Listen up, maggots. Vane's scream was less a human sound and more a sonic assault, rattling the stone and steel of the Labyrinthos. I have heard a rumor. A vile, putrid rumor that one of you, a so-called philosopher, is planning some kind of breakout. A feeble attempt to escape the confines of this necessary institution. My blood ran cold. Escape. I had thought about it 1,000 times, but the idea was impossible. We were locked deep underground. Who could have told him such a blatant lie? Or more terrifyingly, how did he know? Well, I want you to know, Vane continued, his voice intensifying, filled with bile and spittle now visible on the corners of his lips, that it isn't going to happen. In fact, for even daring to harbor the thought of abandoning the Labyrinthos, I think you boys need correction. He paused, inhaling deeply, savoring the collective terror. You boys need to be taught. By planning this, you are pissing in my face. And when you piss in my face, I turn right back around, and I defile your sanctuary. 2 guards, moving with chilling purpose, walked into each of the cells. They retrieved the buckets that had served as makeshift toilets. Since the first day's rebellion, Vane had refused us permission to empty them. They were now brimming with several days' worth of vile excretion, their stench overwhelming the damp cellar air. As one of the guards swung the bucket with a powerful, casual motion, a wave of noxious filth erupted, covering me, my cellmate, and the narrow space in a shower of putrid waste. I gagged, fighting desperately to keep down the little sustenance I had managed to choke down over the last few days. I snarled, wiping the viscous grime from my eyes, the smell so potent it burned my nasal passages. Vane watched the whole process, his face contorted in a triumphant, sick grin. Look how disgusting you are, he roared, pointing an accusing finger at us. You're filthy. You are unworthy. Now I know who hatched this pathetic scheme, and I think it's only fair that you do, too. He turned his reflective gaze on me, the triumph on his face absolute. Isn't that right, prisoner 307? Elias Thorne. I gasped, frozen by the sound of my name and the specific accusation. I looked around the corridor, trying to identify the informer. But then, the sound began. It started as a low, guttural murmur from the cell of light. The husk's vein had rested. Then it spread to the cell opposite, where the broken rebels had been moved. Finally, it reached my own cellmate, who slowly turned his head to face me. My heart plummeted as I saw them all, every single inmate in the Labyrinthos, their eyes gleaming with cold, mirrored light, all turned upon me. The sound swelled into a terrible, synchronized chant, a monotonous, damning litany. Prisoner 307 is a failed vessel. Because of what Prisoner 307 did, the Labyrinthos is defiled, cow-wise Silas Vane. The chant echoed, the rhythmic cadence beating against the stone walls, a hammer blow to my sanity. It was the absolute, total betrayal. I had looked to them for solidarity, for a shared resistance, but Vane had transformed them into a single, psychic, condemning entity. There was nowhere to hide. I looked desperately to my cellmate, the last connection to the old world. He slowly, agonizingly, turned to face me. I dropped to my knees as I saw the truth reflected in his eyes. Perfect, empty mirrors. He was just toying with me. The escape plot was a ruse, a theatrical display designed to shatter my final belief in solidarity. He wanted me to know that I was his, and his alone, that the entire world of the Labyrinthos now existed solely to condemn me. The chant continued, louder, sharper. Prisoner 307 is a failed vessel. Because of what Prisoner 307 did, the Labyrinthos is defiled, cow-wise Silas Vane. Vane sauntered into my cell, ignoring the filth he had caused. He grabbed me by the throat, the strength in his grip immense, and slammed me against the back wall. Prisoner 307 is a failed vessel. Because of what Prisoner 307 did, the Labyrinthos is defiled, cow-wise Silas Vane. I scrabbled uselessly at his massive arm. My air was cut off, and the world began to spin. I saw his fat, forked, black tongue slither its way out of his gaping, bony maw. The stink of decay and stagnant energy was overwhelming. The chant reached a terrifying crescendo as the warden leaned closer, his reflection eyes fixed on mine. Prisoner 307 is a failed vessel. Because of what Prisoner 307 did, the Labyrinthos is defiled, cow-wise Silas Vane. Tears of physical pain and spiritual defeat streamed from my eyes, mixing with the filth on my face. I let out a choked, desperate scream as his tongue slithered up my neck, a sensation of icy violation. It reached my chin, tasted the wet salt of my tears, and then began to pry relentlessly at my tightly clenched lips. I fought, but my body was spent. My jaw was forced open by an invisible, crushing pressure. I felt the cold, repulsive tip of his tongue begin to descend down my throat, not seeking flesh, but seeking the core of my resistance. As that freezing, alien presence wormed its way inside me, invading the last sanctuary of my consciousness, a profound, chilling realization struck me. I was being swallowed whole. Everything went black. I awoke with an involuntary, strangled yelp, my throat raw and my entire body convulsing. I wasn't lying on the cold, filthy stone of the prison cell. I was slumped in a plush, leather office chair. A soothing, quiet voice cut through the ringing in my ears. It's all right. You're safe now. It's over. I fought to clear the viscous film of tears, filth, and terror from my eyes. Standing over me was Joe S. Amory Blackwood. He looked haggard, his usually immaculate academic attire slightly disheveled. I tried to scream again, the memory of the black, forked tongue and immediate, blinding terror, but the sound caught in my throat. Then I looked into his eyes. They were not mirroring. They were pale blue, bloodshot with fatigue, and completely, terrifyingly normal. Listen to me, Elias, Blackwood said, kneeling down to my level. You are not prisoner 307. You are Elias Thorne, a philosophy student. I am Dr. Blackwood, a psychologist. This is not a real prison. This was just an experiment. Those were just students, Elias, just like you. The relief that flooded my system was so immense it felt like a physical rupture, chasing away the darkness that had consumed me. It was over. The Labyrinthos was just brick and steel. Vane was just a costume. The mirrors were just madness. Blackwood quickly ushered me out of the underground complex, through service tunnels that reeked of dust and damp. Finally, we emerged into the blinding, bright sunlight of the late afternoon. It was the world. The real world. It was over. Blackwood then led me to a quiet, isolated office on the main campus of Ravenscroft. He handed me an envelope so thick it felt like a small brick. The experiment was terminated prematurely, he stated, his voice now regaining its professional, measured tone. Unforeseen psychological breakdowns amongst several participants necessitated an immediate conclusion. We realized the role-playing environment became too immersive. He avoided my gaze. Elias, I need your absolute silence on what you experienced down there. You will sign this non-disclosure agreement. In return, this sum, far exceeding the initial promised amount, is yours. It will cover your tuition and more. You will never have to speak of the Labyrinthos again. It was the typical academic cover-up, a desperate attempt to protect his reputation and his career. They had realized what was truly lurking in that basement, or perhaps, what they had unleashed, and they had pulled me out just in time. The timing was too coincidental. I knew Blackwood had saved me not out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. I signed the papers, took the envelope containing enough cash to save my future, and walked out of Ravenscroft Academy. From what I later gathered, the remaining students, both guards and prisoners, were released the following day. Blackwood spun a calculated story to the university and the public, attributing the termination to ethical concerns about the speed of psychological decay, a palatable lie that kept his career intact. I never saw any of the others again. I have no idea if the students who played the guards ever recovered from the darkness they wielded, or if the prisoners, broken and emptied, ever found their way back to sanity. Were their eyes still mirroring the hollow world around them? I dropped out of college soon after, the prospect of studying philosophy, the search for light and meaning, now a cruel, impossible joke. I used the money to move far away, to a small coastal town, and built a life for myself. A quiet life. A safe life. A life deliberately stripped of ambition, complexity, or risk. But the Labyrinthos was never truly contained. To this day, I wake up drenched in sweat, paralyzed by the thought of that freezing, alien presence attempting to worm its way into my soul. The stink of the filth and the sound of the damned litany are etched permanently into my memory. I wrote this account, as advised by a new therapist, to try and externalize the trauma. To tell the world the truth, that it wasn't a failed experiment, but a ritual of transference, where an ancient, malevolent entity used the framework of a psychological study to feed and spread its taint. But as I finish writing, the sun has set, and the shadows have lengthened. I stand up, weary, and walk to the small bathroom. I turn on the light and stare into the mirror. I see Elias Thorne. I see the tired lines, the lingering paranoia, the philosopher who saw too much. But every night, when I look into that reflection, I see past the surface. I see the truth Silas Vane forced me to absorb. My eyes are wide. They are empty. And they are no longer blue. They are perfect, cold, black mirrors. They stare back at me, reflecting nothing but the hollow room and the profound, isolating darkness. They are the permanent, undeniable echo of the Labyrinthos. I am not Elias Thorne anymore. I am a vessel. I am a failed vessel. And I know, with chilling certainty, that I will always be his. His and his alone.